You open the meeting, bring Carolyn in, please. Bring anyone who's interested in listening in. I do not see a big audience here tonight. Are we online? And we have a number of people online. Okay, very good. This is a special meeting of the PGUSD Board of Education dealing specifically with discussions and questions. It's intended as a town hall and some back and forth on the redistricting of, strike that, the districting, the at-large districting for trustee elections starting in 2022 and moving forward from then on. Roll call, please. Here. Here.
Here.
Here.
Here.
Here.
Thank you. Most of this meeting will be run by Harold Freeman and Jonathan Barry Smith, both from Lozano Smith. Is that correct? Yeah, thank you. And they'll answer most of the discussions. Just briefly, though, this is really about how to go from an at-large to district voting for the trustees. You know, at-large voters of the entire district may vote for any and all trustees. So you're voting for up to 3 at any given point. We rotate basically 2 and then 3 and keep going on that cycle. By district, voters really only vote for 1 trustee for their district. And the 2-minute history here, in 1965, the Federal Civil Rights Act is passed, and what it did is it eliminated restrictions on voters. It tried to say, look, everybody has the right to vote. It didn't try and balance the field in terms of who got elected. It said that everybody has the right to vote and struck down many items, which we're still arguing back and forth on now, but that's not part of tonight. Minority groups can be disenfranchised, sometimes just money and campaigning, but also through vote dilution. If you have a block of 25%, the 75% can overwhelm you one way or the other. And really at the end, you say, well, that means that we haven't changed much in terms of who gets elected. Fast forward to 1986 and the Supreme Court rules, there are conditions that must be met to demonstrate disenfranchisement, basically to say that people can be disenfranchised. Is the minority group sufficiently large to elect a representative? Is it a protected class? Is that group politically cohesive? If there's no clear candidate that they might accept, then they wouldn't be politically cohesive. And do the majority of voters usually vote to defeat the minority preferred candidate? However, these are tough conditions to meet. And it's a very high hurdle. And in 2001, signed in 2002 by Gray Davis, the California Voting Rights Act passed. And this was an attempt to eliminate the requirements of that protected class, make it so that it was easier for minority groups to ensure their votes are not diluted by at-large elections. So what we do there is we change to districts. You take the at-large where you can get fully diluted, and you present it in such a manner such that minority representation is easier to achieve. One almost immediate and natural and quite foreseeable result was a series of lawsuits that racially polarized voting existed in districts. And the burden of proof seemed to fall to cities and districts and other legal entities, counties, to demonstrate otherwise. Large dollar amounts eventually did change hands. Stockton, Modesto, I believe San Diego had a suit against. But in 2016, California tried to help this a little bit. It did not fully eliminate the lawsuits. It did amend CVRA, and part of that was to create a safe harbor provision and a timeline in which to make changes. Nonetheless, the changes are forthcoming. PG has no history of that, but it has minority representation right now. And on occasion, I think has had times where there are not sufficient candidates. And I think you ran with a 4-person board for a little while, didn't you? Beth Shamus is in there, so a little bit. Nonetheless, to avoid litigation and to ensure transparency, in 2020, a year ago, and then some, PGUSD trustees, and that's John Walton, Brian Swanson, Debbie Crandall, Christy Dawson, and myself, discussed and agreed to implement a resolution basically the next year. We wanted to wait a year after the census results to replace at-large with by-district elections. And in 2021, we passed a resolution to move forward with that decision. In fact, PG has since received a demand letter, but we already passed the resolution and the letter and potential suit was withdrawn. As it turns out, with the exception of Santa Monica, and I think the jury is still out on that, that was a very narrow decision. In hundreds of cases, no city or district has really successfully defended at-large districts. So we are prudent to take this move and move forward. A second positive, and this is really a very positive thing for me, is that because the potential change is to match the constituency by going to by-district elections, there's hearsay that by-district tends to increase the number of candidates. So you actually get a better and larger candidate pool. Because in fact, the districts are smaller and easier to reach. Individuals have a greater incentive to reach within that area. We've already agreed to by district for 2022. This meeting is to try and get some further information, which we will not act on. We're not voting on tonight, but we are providing back to demographers at a later date to help suggest what the districts might look like and provide further information to anyone who might have it. Part of it is what constraints, if any, do we have a district wish to place? We will hear of a tool for creating maps and providing that feedback back to trustees. As it stands right now, I don't think that has PG Unified School District data in it yet. I will ask you that later. And that is because the census data is brand new. And quite frankly, I don't know how they do it. I assume there's some massive upload that requires tweaking here and there to make it all work. Anyway, with that introduction, I hand this over to Harold Freeman and Jonathan Berry Smith.
At that, I'm not good with technology, so yeah. Good evening, I'm Harold Freeman. Jonathan Berry Smith is we're going to take turns here. And I'm going to speak to you a little bit, just building on what you just heard from the board president about what brings us here, some of the background, what's going on in the state, some of the relevant law. And then Jonathan is going to come talk to you about the specifics of your timing and where you are in the process. And then obviously we're here and happy to answer questions as we go along the way. So we can dig right in and we'll start with the California Voting Rights Act. You'll hear us refer to it as CVRA a lot. So that's what we're talking about, is California Voting Rights Act. If you ever want to read it, it's short. It's easily found in the elections code. It's section 14025 through 14032. 7 little code sections that don't take up anything like the very thick education code, for example, but there's a lot buried in there. What the CVRA does is it talks about that you are not supposed to use at-large elections. At-large, again, we've heard about a little bit from the board president, where everybody in the district votes for all of the board members. You're not supposed to use at-large elections if they have these 3 potential outcomes, all of which involve impairing the ability of a minority group, a protected class, to be able to elect the candidates of their choice. And I always want to stop on that, candidates of their choice. It's not a matter of electing minority candidates. It's that the minority population has a say in selecting the candidates of their preference. So we've worked with districts before that had, for example, very large Latinx populations. They will have an election and a predominantly Caucasian board is elected. That's okay if those were the preferred candidates of the Latinx population. So it's not just a matter of looking at a board and thinking, what is the cultural background of each board member? It's a little more complex than that. So you're not supposed to use these at-large elections to influence the outcome of an election or to result in racially polarized voting. Racially polarized voting is a concept that comes from the Federal Voting Rights Act, or FVRA, and basically talks about the notion that particular classes of people, particular protected classes, are having their votes drowned out because of the particular way that people vote. There's language that in the elections code that is in the CVRA talking about influencing the outcome of an election, that talks about influencing it, quote, as a result of the dilution or the abridgment of rights of voters who are members of a protected class. So you heard from the board president this notion of dilution, this idea that at a certain point there may be a candidate that is preferred by a minority group, but being in the minority, they don't have the influence to be able to elect that candidate of choice. You don't see a lot about direct abridgment of rights to votes. That's, driving people away from the polls and whatnot. So really what we talk about is this dilution concept. Go to the next slide. And you saw at the bottom there, and you heard from the board president that under the CVRA, you don't have to show intentional discrimination. That's not part of this entire factor. So at-large elections, we've tried a million different graphics to very simply explain this. This is one of the ones that we've attempted. Basically within the district boundary, which is that rectangle that you see, everybody votes for the board members. So everybody in the district gets to vote ultimately for all 5 seats on the board. You can go to the next slide. With by trustee area elections, you now break the district into defined areas, and we'll talk to you more about what that looks like, and you'll get to learn a lot about that from the demographers when they're with you in the future. And the people in the voters in a particular trustee area only elect the trustee from their area, and that person has to be a resident of that particular trustee area. The process that you've embarked on is to define what your trustee areas are going to be, where you're going to draw those boundaries. One of the questions we get a lot, and I thought I would just sort of head it off, is can you have a hybrid approach? Can you have an approach where, for example, people have to live within a particular trustee area, but everybody in the district gets to vote? So you have 5 trustees representing 5 areas, but they're elected by everybody in the district. Under the CVRA, that's still considered at large. So it's as if you've done nothing for the purposes of the CVRA. The only way that you can get there, the only safe harbor, is that by trustee area election. Go to the next slide. So you heard this from the board president. One of the striking things about the CVRA is it's been around for a couple decades now, and in that time period, we don't see public agencies winning those lawsuits. And when I say that, there have been public agencies that have tried to litigate this facially, saying the CVRA is unconstitutional. We've had people try to litigate it as trying to say the CVRA as applied in our area is legal, and they don't win. And the reason they don't win is that the CVRA has very high standards to be able to successfully defend an action against you. CVRA challenges are on the rise. When I say a challenge, what that looks like under the CVRA is you get a demand letter from a plaintiff's attorney representing some group within your area. That plaintiff's attorney makes the demand that you move to by trustee areas. Once you get that, there's a limited time period for you to act in, after which they can file a lawsuit. The reason that's really important, that time frame, is that if you take the action to adopt a resolution of intent to move to trustee areas, and you do so, the most that they can recover from you, it's $30,000 increased by inflation. So then you will get a demand from plaintiff's counsel for what is now about $32,000. If you don't make that commitment and you don't meet the timelines thereafter, the plaintiff can file a lawsuit against you, and there is no cap on the dollar amount that they can seek from you. We'll get there in a moment, but some of the settlements and awards have been really quite significant. We listed just some of the CVRA challenges that, or again, these demand letters that districts and cities have been getting. You see some, we had Bay Area examples. We should have included the city of Greenfield received one of these, for example, here in Monterey County, and you received one, fortunately, after we started the process, and we'll come back to that. We do expect eventually that every local agency in the state is going to get a demand, without exception. There are 5 or 6 plaintiffs' attorneys that are just going around the state sending these letters. And so, unfortunately, it does become inevitable. And many districts decide, rather than waiting for the demand, paying attorneys' fees to make the transition themselves, which is really where you find yourselves. We can go to the next slide. I just put up some examples here with Jonathan of the high cost of litigation. I'll come back to the city of Santa Monica case in just a moment, because obviously that's a rather staggering number. But you can see some of the court-ordered dollar amounts of attorney's fees that have been paid in this type of litigation is in the millions. You see the $3 million that the city of Santa Clara had awarded against it. You see even in the settlements that the amounts are often in several $100,000 once the litigation's been filed. So there's great incentive to make this transition without waiting for a demand. And to editorialize on that for a moment, for those districts like yours that have decided to make the change without waiting for a demand, you're also in the driver's seat. You have much more say on what your timing is going to be and controlling your own process. Statewide, we don't have an exact count for you, but approximately 25% of the school districts in the state have transitioned to by trustee area elections. That's a striking number because in 2018-19, that number was about 12%. So we've seen in a course of 2 or 3 years doubling, and we think that trend is just going to continue on and on. We go to the next slide. Here we talked about this a little bit already, but this $30,000 plus inflation amount, if somebody makes a demand, as the board president pointed out, you did receive a demand. You received a demand on August 18th. Fortunately, that demand came after you'd already started the process, and the plaintiff's counsel in that case was fairly reasonable, was informed about where you were in the process, was able to go to your website, see that you had information about it, that you'd taken all the steps necessary, and basically withdrew their demand on you. So right there, your timing of when you started this saved the district over $30,000, which we were very happy your timing worked out that way. I have worked with districts before where literally as they're approaching the board meeting to adopt the resolution, they get the demand letter. And that ends up costing them that $30,000 plus. So that's a big picture overview of the CVRA, what's been going on in the state. Jonathan's going to take over and talk to you a little more about what you're doing in your district specifically.
Thank you, Harold. So yeah, I'm just going to briefly touch on where the district has, what the district has completed already in this process. Statutorily, there are a lot of meetings that need to occur, and the district is well on its way. So as you can see, both the intent resolution and both pre-map hearings have already occurred. The intent resolution was passed on April 22nd, basically telling the public that the district was going to go through this process August 19th and then September 16th. These dates by statute have to be within 30 days of each other. 2 public hearings occurred. The demographer for the district was also there to share information and basically gather input from the community on what these proposed trustee area lines could look like. Now to go to the next slide, we can touch on what the next few steps are going to be. So at the start of the new year, January 20th and February 3rd are the dates that the district currently has scheduled to host the 2 post-map hearings, as we call them. And so these are opportunities a week before each of these hearings, the demographer will have posted or shared with the district to share publicly a couple of draft trustee area maps. And so members of the community will have time to review those maps, consider them, and then at these post-map hearings, discuss what they like about them, what they dislike about them, whether any changes can be made. And then at those 2 meetings, the demographer will take those considerations into account. Moving forward to February 17th, this is the final public hearing for the district's sake, where they eventually adopt their proposed final map. And this last step here, to be determined, I say in February or March, because it will be based upon when the Monterey County Committee on School District Organization is available to have this meeting. But by statute, the county committees have the power and authority to change the method of a district's elections from at-large to by trustee. So they will basically have the chance to consider the district's proposal and then approve or deny it. Then if you could move on to the next slide, this is just another short overview of what I basically just described. Just leave it on the screen. So if people watching online want to see what dates are coming up, maybe want to jot them down. I'll also note that every meeting that's occurred already is posted on the Pacific Grove Unified School District website. There's a CVRA page dedicated to this information. So that's always a good place for members of the community to go to if they're curious about what's coming up or what has already happened. And so if you go to the next slide, I'm going to briefly touch upon some of the criteria that demographers use when developing these trustee areas. So first and foremost, federal law dictates what these by trustee area look like, what trustee area boundaries, certain criteria that must be followed. So equal population, that's a relatively well-known one. The boundary should be established to where the population is nearly as equal as possible. The law allows for an around 10% deviation in the population from each of the trustee areas. So the demographer will clearly try to split up the district's boundaries in a manner where population is equal throughout. And then the Federal Voting Rights Act, which we've discussed briefly, is also something that needs to be followed. Federal law applies to all of our local agencies. Basically, the boundaries should be established so that the trustee areas do not result in any denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen to vote on account of race or color. And Section 2, when I say VRA, that I mean Federal Voting Rights Act. And then finally, there should be no racial gerrymandering. So basically, to sum this up, it's basically this case that indicated that certain gerrymandering methods, such as packing and cracking, these are terms that our demographer has discussed in the past, where instead of like packing all of the minority votes into one trustee area, or cracking them, separating them into multiple trustee areas to the point where they don't have voting power. That's also, these are the 3 federal laws that the demographer will definitely be considering in drafting the maps. We might ask, all 3 of these criteria could be established and still allow for variability in acceptable maps. This is where the next slide comes into play. What else can a demographer consider after the federal criteria have been established and satisfied? So in establishing trustee area boundaries, there's additional criteria that a demographer can consider, and so far as practical, for any needed deviations from, the general rules that we just discussed. And some of those main criteria include compact boundaries, contiguous boundaries, like if you're just looking at the map, seeing that areas are compact and contiguous. Respecting communities of interest, this is an important one that members of the community can actually help the demographer understand what communities of interest are there in Pacific Grove. And this isn't explicitly defined. It could be something as long as, I don't know, people who are in the same Little League attendance area, or people of a particular religious background that go to like the same church and they consider themselves a community of interest. Basically, a group of people that believe that they should be kept together because they have similar voting preferences. And so that would be something that members of the community can help the board and the demographer understand what areas and what groups of people should not be split up. Some other criteria: topography, geography. This could help, like, certain man-made boundaries or natural boundaries that clearly delineate one area from another. That can definitely be considered. And another thing that the demographers consider is expected future population growth. I will not go too far into that because I'd rather the demographer with technical expertise on that explain further how that works. And then there's also other criteria that the board or members of the community can consider when sharing with the demographer what they want the maps to look like. But just remember those fundamental 3 federal components criteria must be considered in maps. These are all optional. And with that, I think we're opening up. Oh yeah, of course.
And if I can just add two quick thoughts before we open this up. One of them is with those criteria, it's sometimes helpful to hear an example. So I'm thinking of a district that I worked with when we were trying to determine communities of interest, and the demographer drew one of the maps that defined a particular area. And a number of people from a neighborhood came out and said, actually, this divides what we consider our neighborhood. And the demographer couldn't tell that it was a neighborhood because geographically it didn't look like a neighborhood, but they understood it to be a neighborhood and it had its own name and whatnot. We've had people come forward and say, we don't want to split up our homeowners association. We don't want to split up, as you heard from Jonathan, Little League. So it's really, that's a great opportunity for members of the public to say, this is how we identify ourselves. Your demographer will learn a lot about your community by looking at the maps, by studying it, but they will also learn a lot when the time comes and you're looking at those maps to hear from your community. So that's always a very helpful thing. I also, as most of you know, I used to live in Pacific Grove, so I also feed the demographer a lot of information from the 7 years I lived here. But again, hearing from your community will be the most helpful thing of all. And then the other thing I just wanted to, I think it's worth mentioning, actually from a conversation I was having with the board president, there's another process that's going on right now in the county called redistricting. Those are for school districts and local agencies that already moved to by trustee areas. And under the CVRA and under the education code, if you have a situation where you already are by trustee area, every 10 years you have to revisit your boundaries. You have to look at it again when the census data comes out. And the purpose of looking at it is to see if you have to rebalance the population. You heard from Jonathan about not having more than a 10% deviation in population between two trustee areas. Sometimes by the time the next census comes, what used to be a 5% deviation is now a 20% deviation. You see that more, frankly, in areas that are developing. A lot of new development, new neighborhoods being built. Obviously, Pacific Grove is very established. So it's possible 10 years from now when this comes up, you won't have to do anything with your maps because the boundaries will still work for population balance, but you have to go through that process. The reason I wanted to mention that is that there may be some confusion because there's districting, which is what you're doing. There's redistricting, which is what these other agencies are doing. They have different timelines and they have different requirements. So you get a lot of questions sometimes about why is X school district doing it this way and Y school district doing it that way. Two totally different processes. For example, you have to have the 5 public hearings. A school district going through redistricting doesn't have to have any public hearings. Typically they do 1, 2, or 3. There's a lot more flexibility. They also have to finish ahead of you. They only have until the end of February. You can push into March. And in fact, legally, you could push all the way up into early July, but the Registrar of Voters has made it very clear to do their work to get everything election ready for 2022. They need the board to make a decision. They need the county committee to approve that decision really by the end of March. And the reason for that is because so many of this redistricting is going on where people are adjusting their boundaries. The registrar just doesn't have the people power, the bandwidth to cover that many. So that impacts the timeline. So we just wanted to point out that distinction is again, there may be some confusion. And with that, we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Do we have even the, and I should have asked you in advance, my apologies. Do we have the just map that was tossed out very early on available to us right now?
I don't think we have it here with us. That
doesn't
was just,
matter. I mean, it was just a map, just so that we did have something against which to look and say, okay, this is what this might mean, knowing that that was not going to be real. But okay, very good. Thank you. With that, we'll just go starting left to right here. Frank, any questions that immediately pop up?
Not right now.
Christy?
Yeah, I appreciate this. When we first heard about it, I remember just trying to wrap my mind around what it meant. Seemed a bit tough, but with each explanation, every time you guys go through it, it becomes easier to understand. And I just appreciate you being here so the community can understand with this town hall. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Carolyn?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I was wondering if our experts could explain to the public just kind of what their ballots will look like for our voters going forward.
So what will happen is all of this would take effect for the 2022 election, and thereafter, there are going to be residents of Pacific Grove that will have a ballot that has, because they're in a trustee area that is up for election, that will have a specific candidate or candidates for their trustee area, there's going to be other people who will not get a ballot for school board because they're in a trustee area that still has an incumbent that has another 2 years beyond the election remaining. So that's the major change, is that you will not be in a situation anymore where every 2 years you are voting for school board. It will now be every 4 years that you're voting for school board.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about, I know you had mentioned it to us, but for the public, I've heard a couple of times folks worry that we'll have less candidates overall running. And can you expand on your experience and what you've seen during this process, if that's taken place or if the opposite has taken place with more people running?
Yeah, certainly I'm happy to. We've had a number of school districts that are relatively speaking smaller school districts, some smaller than Pacific Grove, some just a little larger, where there has been a concern. You haven't had a lot of people running for office. And so are you going to really be able to get at least one person running for each trustee area? What we have seen, and we often talk to demographers that have heard the same thing that are in this field, is generally more people start running. And that's actually something the CVRA intends. If you think about it, if you want to run for school board district-wide, you have to pamphlet district-wide, you have to knock on doors district-wide. If you have to run in 1/5 of the district, that is a smaller area to be able to actually meet people, talk to them. It's less photocopying of the flyers when you're going to do that. And I'm thinking of one particular district I work with, and I think of them only because they're very similar in size to you, where there was a lot of concern because they'd actually had multiple school board elections where nobody ran, and they had to actually find somebody and appoint them. And in their first election, they had 2 people run in one trustee area and 3 in the other, which was remarkable because in the prior election, they had 3 seats open and they only had 1 person for any of those 3 seats as a candidate. So we can't guarantee that that's going to replicate itself, but generally speaking, that tends to be the trend that we've seen.
Wow, thank you, Mr. Freeman. My last question is there anything that you've seen districts do in general that can kind of help recruit, or I don't want to say recruit, if districts can help support candidates overall? Because now this is a new, it's a new format of elections, and it sounds like we're wanting to encourage people to run. So are there any great options that you've seen for boards to kind of support that in their community?
Sure. You have to be a little careful because you can't expend district funds on campaigning for anybody, but educating people you can do. And there are districts that, for example, we've worked with, in one county of Office of Education that we work with that's done this, that have trainings, if you will, on how to run. What is involved? What are the time frames? And even get into sometimes some of the issues about what is this Brown Act that you hear about that you have to live with? Just some basic training so that you have an educated pool of people who are potentially running. So you can certainly do some education. You can do some outreach that way. We've also seen, for example, the Women's League of Voters in different areas that will put on trainings encouraging people to run and the like. There's one district in Southern California years ago that just had a coffee and donuts open house before time to pull papers, and invited anybody who wanted to talk about what it meant to be a board member to come and actually talk to incumbent board members. I thought that was an interesting piece of outreach. I don't know if it worked or not, but I'm sure they had good coffee and donuts. And then the other thing is, and I don't know if your district does this or not, there are districts that pay the filing fees for anybody who runs for office. I'm seeing some nods. That's something you do here. Obviously, that's a very appealing approach because somebody doesn't have to come out of pocket at all in that regard.
Yeah, it is something we do, but I feel like no one really knows that. So it's another part of that education we can do to help. Thank you so much, Mr. Freeman and Mr. Barry Smith. Those are all my questions.
Yeah, just one thing. If we could we put the slides back up, please? When you talked about criteria used by the demographers, I'm just looking for an example, especially as it relates to the Federal Voting Rights Act. I'm not getting my head around that.
So how the Federal Voting Rights Act, how those federal criteria work their way in. Yeah, let's get to that. So let me jump start, and then if you want to jump in, feel free. I'm thinking particularly a question we get a lot is about the no racial gerrymandering, because there's an almost intellectual disconnect when you talk about let's create trustee areas that are influenced by increasing a protected class's voting, but let's not pack everybody in a particular race in a particular area. So what the federal courts have said about gerrymandering is it's okay for CVRA purposes to be looking at, for example, what is the Asian Pacific Islander population of a particular area of the district, and trying to keep that population together to increase their voting rights, their voting ability. What you can't do is start drawing the long spaghetti strands to capture another area. Okay. So I think in one of these procedures I went through once where there was a plaintiff's counsel, he felt very strongly that we should get as close as possible in that particular district to a trustee area that was 50% plus one Latinx. And there was literally no way you could do it without drawing the spaghetti strands. And ultimately the demographer actually had to draw what it would look like. And then it didn't pass the facial test. It had those strands all over.
Okay.
Do you want to add anything on that?
No, that's good. Yeah.
Great, that helps. Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you very much. Board, we were offered a number of items here as criteria. And again, we're just looking for information being fed back. I would say that, I'm definitely of the try and make them as cookie cutter as possible. So as compact and insofar as practicable would be on my list. I think we need to be able to feed these back to the district. Dr. Porras, we have a mechanism for that arranged. Okay. Did you want to add anything, by the way? Okay, thanks. That'll do. Yes. Sorry, I should have asked earlier. And of that list of additional 7 items with a couple question marks, there is an interesting addenda to all this. We are going to, at district, and in conversation earlier, we could, in fact, actually, to minimize the district change later on, elect 2 2-year terms and 3 4-year terms. That would be a much longer conversation. But it has been done, I understand. Is that correct, Mr. Freeman?
It's been done in the context of litigation,
okay. So
where it's been a settlement of the claim against the district. There may be a mechanism to get there, but again, that's a more complicated conversation.
The only real rationale for that would be is it makes the districting potentially easier, but it has a significant downside in that you have the potential to lose 5 candidates simultaneously. That's the downside. So with that, I will open up to the floor. Anyone wishing to make comments? We will start internal and go to external. Do you have anything?
Beth Shamas. I have a question about the demographers and when they're looking at maybe you guys don't know this, but when they're looking at the census, do you know what they are looking for in terms of what matters to them? And I'm thinking like in terms of Pacific Grove, I'm thinking of, we have military community, we have renters, we have second homes. So second homes, they don't count on a census, or do they? Those are kind of our qualities in Pacific Grove that I'm wondering is, would the demographers take those kinds of pieces into consideration? I'm sure rentals, maybe that would be, but that was my question.
Thank you. And to members of the public and in general, this is intended as a town hall, as Q&A. If there are questions I can answer, I will. Otherwise, I will defer to Mr. Freeman or Jonathan. Sorry, it's Barry Smith. It's the hyphen that's getting me. I'm sorry. Mr. Barry Smith, if they would like to reflect on any of that or simply take it as a question, it's possible it's not answerable right now, and let us know. But it is intended to try and actually, unlike most public comment at board meetings, to provide some answers if we have them. So, Mr. Barry Smith, go ahead.
I'll definitely try my best. So it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, those would qualify as criteria that a demographer could consider secondarily after focusing on those three main federal criteria, you know, the equal population, et cetera. And the only way for, or one of the few ways for the demographer to understand, you know, like, oh, like this military population or homeowners association, like any additional information that can't be seen on like a census GIS file would be for members of the community to come to the 2 post-map hearings and share. While looking at these maps, it looks like you cut this community, our neighborhood, in half. And if the demographer didn't know that until that moment, they could go back and there's time. That's why there's 2 public hearings after the census data has been released and the maps have been drawn, to allow for members of the community to share that input and for the demographer to, insofar as practicable, take it into consideration. So
you very well could. What Ms. Shamas said was, right now, could I write and provide my inputs to the demographer? And the answer is yes, please do. Okay.
Oh yeah, and we are here to, so even though the demographer is not here, what we hear at the town hall, we will share with the demographer. So if, yeah, we could let him know.
And in fact, that very specific item, how does one work within the military community, is a very good question. I'm not sure there's a method. I'm not sure how we even know, but thank you. I see Mr. Hazen's hand raised. Dr. Hazen.
Hi, thank you very much. And 2 quick questions. One similar to Ms. Shamas's, specifically at previous meetings, we've discussed the idea of having potentially 2 trustees from an area rather than separating into 5 separate areas. Again, given the size, and I'm also equally worried about the vacation homes. So I wanted to make sure that that is not in violation of the Voters Act and Voters' Rights Act, and if we could have that be part of the considerations when we are drawing up maps. And my second quick question on that too is there anything stopping someone who, for say, owns 5 homes from just basically choosing whichever group they want to run in so they have the best chance of being elected? And maybe that's a simple California elections question, not specific to the school board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hazen. Harold, would you like to? And I'm going to, Elliot, I hope you don't mind if I tag on to that. When we talk about the population of Pacific Grove, we're actually talking about registered voters. So if it's a second home here, it's not counting anyway. It's unrelated to the number of homes. We could have 300,000 or we could have 300 homes. It doesn't really matter if there's 15,000 registered voters. Am I correct in that understanding?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You stole my thunder. What you look at always under CVRA and FVRA is what we call CVAP, Citizens of Voting Age Population. So it's not necessarily registered voters. It's does somebody reside in the home who is a citizen of voting age population? So somebody who can vote, not maybe they haven't registered yet. So it's a little bit different than that. But we also know under California law, you can only have one domicile. You're only allowed to have one home, which is considered as the place for which you pay your taxes. Excuse me, you're entitled to vote, et cetera. And so somebody can't claim 5 homes as their residences. They can only claim one. Just as a school board member running for a school board, you may own 2 homes in the community. You have to pick the one that is your residence. Generally, you know, it's backed up by all of these other things, whereas your driver's license registered to, for example. The possibility of the 2 trustees per area. I mentioned earlier that under CVRA, if you have any type of hybrid approach, it is generally considered not to be a by trustee area election. So there are school districts, there's one that we work with that has 2 trustee areas. One has 3 trustees in it, one has 2 trustees, or actually I think it may be 4 trustees in one and 3 in the other. They have 7. That technically does not protect them from somebody making a claim under the CVRA, having to pay the attorney's fees, having to either litigate it or agree to make the change down the road. The only model is 1 trustee per area under the CVRA. That's the only thing that's considered by trustee. So this is a system you could consider, but it's not going to insulate you from potential legal challenges.
Dr. Hazen, that answer both your questions? Still online. very good. It's okay. He'll ring back in, I'm confident. Ms. Miller.
Two pretty easy questions. Number one, who is the demographer? And number two, I wasn't sure how the candidates running for the trustee areas what their terms would be. Are they all would be running for 4-year terms, or some for 4-year terms, some for 2-year terms? I am coming in late to this conversation. I mean, as far as not having been at the other presentation. So I'd like answers to those, and thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. To the latter question, in our district right now, we were all running for 4-year terms, and that is not going to change unless, quite frankly, the board so very conscious and in my current mindset, probably completely improbable decision to try and attempt something different. It doesn't seem prudent for us to do that. So this upcoming election, we will have 3 districts, all of which will vote for 4-year terms. As to the prior, I have to defer to Mr. Barry Smith here.
So the district's demographer is a demographer from National Demographics Corporation by the name of Jeff Tilton. He's the primary demographer. I believe at the first public hearing, a different demographer from NDC, one of his colleagues presented. I believe it was Justin, but moving forward, it will likely be Jeff Tilton showing up at these post-map hearings and gathering information and working on drafting the maps. And that's we kind of covered.
Could you spell his name? It's hard with the math.
Jeff Tilton, Tilton.
Thank you.
And with, I'm sorry, National Demographer
Corporation.
Corporation.
It
is corporation.
Might be National Demographics Corporation, I think. Okay. National Demographics Corporation, NDC.
NDC, yeah. Demographics Corporation, very good. That makes more sense. Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Miller, I hope that answered your questions. I see no other questions on board. Dr. Porras, we briefly discussed a method for providing this feedback. Can you comment on that further?
I suspect part of it is how the board would like to receive that feedback.
Okay.
And I think also in regards to what's probably the best, most transparent method of doing that as recommended by our legal counsel.
And actually the one question is, does it go to us and then forward it, or does it go directly? It goes directly to the demographer in no small part, correct? We want to send that both parties immediately, so there's no.
Ultimately, the key is to get everything into the hands of the demographer. It's fine if it flows through the district, but as comments are received, to forward them to the demographer. And I should mention NDC, the entity that's doing this, has done, to our knowledge, more of this work than anybody in California has done. So I'd also encourage folks, going back to the last question, go look up their website and see the hundreds of agencies they've done this for. So they get this stuff, but they need the information. And so as information is fed to the district, as you receive comments, the comments tonight obviously will be shared with NDC. You have a web page that's up. And so there's ways that people can track how they can get information into you. So the more that they can get before those maps are produced, even after those maps are produced, the better. But flowing it through the district is because they're going to be hearing from hundreds of folks. So I wouldn't try to reach out directly to them.
Okay, thank you.
Would it be appropriate to post that information on the CVRA webpage in terms of here's the person that you can send your questions to, or would you recommend that they post those questions to us so we know what they're asking and then forward it?
Yeah, I think having it flow through the district will be good because again, the thing to remember is how many public agencies are going through redistricting right now, and the demographers are overwhelmed. And so that way they see clearly it's coming from Pacific Road. They know who it's coming from. They know what it relates to.
We'll work with you to set up the page so that it's very clear in that regard.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Porras, thank you very much. Yes, Frank.
Just glancing at the map, I noticed that the 3 trustees that are up for the elections in 2022, quite possibly could be residing in an area where a trustee that's not up until 2024 lives. Have you come across that situation before?
Yes. So, okay, buckle your seatbelts because it's complicated. And one of the reasons it's complicated is because the law is unclear and there's differences of opinion in different counties about how that works. And so I don't have an immediate answer, but I can talk to you about it generally. The first thing is one of the criteria that the board will probably want to think about is whether you want the map to take into consideration where trustees live. Some districts do this blind, where they just say, give us the map that makes the most sense. And if all 5 of us live in one trustee area, so be it. Others say, and we believe this is legally defensible, there's case law that supports this, that says to the extent feasible, please take into consideration where we live. One of the advantages of taking into account where you live, it's not just trying to preserve the seat of an incumbent, it's to avoid the question you just asked, which is what happens if you've created a trustee area where there's a 2022 member, so they're elected in 2022 to a 4-year term, there's a 2-year remaining term person who already lives in the same trustee area. There's 2 possibilities. One is that second board member cannot rerun at the end of their term. They are basically, the seat's already been taken. The other way of looking at it is that first trustee couldn't be elected because the seat was already taken for the trustee area. So if the board moves forward and doesn't want to take into consideration where trustees live, and you end up with a map, and even if you do take into consideration, it's conceivable you'd end up with a map that pairs trustees in one area, then we have to look at and really think about the timing. The one thing you have that you can control, and we haven't really talked about today, is when you create your 5 trustee areas, you get to make a recommendation to the county committee of which of those seats will be for one election cycle, which of those seats will be for another election cycle. If they all fit within your existing incumbent trustees, it's easy. Those who have 2 years left become the seats that are 2 years remaining terms. Those that have 4 years left become the 4-year remaining terms. Again, if they get put in the same trustee area, then you have to break it down and study, did we pair 2 trustees that are up in 2024? Well, that's easy. Or did we pair a 2022 with the 2024? It's just really complicated at that point. So I know it's a nebulous answer to a difficult question.
Good, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see Councilman Potery's hand up.
Yes, thank you. I'm in the same boat as Ms. Sharon Miller. I missed the first presentation. I kind of gotten late here. So to actually kind of supplement what Ms. Miller was asking, the demographer, it appears that there's only one demographer that is assigned to the area to do the redistricting. So my question is this demographer nonpartisan to begin with? And if they're not nonpartisan, will we get more than one demographer to neutralize whatever they're doing? Thank you.
Thank you.
They are nonpartisan is the answer. They have no particular affiliation. And if you go to their website, you'll see that they've worked with multiple different political parties, jurisdictions all around the state, as well as in Arizona, and I think some others out of state. So they try very hard to stay out of any sort of partisan participation. And I should note too, when we talk about Jeff Tilton being the demographer, all of NDC is your demographer. Jeff is the person who's going to be taking the lead. So there's a lot of different demographers within that entity that will be involved, but they have no particular political affiliation.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll go back on the board and just walk back in reverse direction here, starting with Brian. Any last questions on it?
No, nothing further for me, thanks.
Okay, Ms. Swanson.
Are we, is the board telling the demographer right now, by way of the attorneys that are here, are we saying that we want them to do the maps according to where we have our trustees living currently?
In fact, we are not taking any actions tonight. We are simply providing out information. If we decide on separate criteria, we will need to do that in a future meeting.
Okay, so we're not going to talk about that. Okay, got it. That's my last question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
Carolyn, in fact, commenting on it is perfectly reasonable. I mean, if that is one, I've already commented that, in fact, for me, you know, as cookie cutter as possible would be preferred. And if you would like to say, you know, I'd like really to make sure we do address that, that's very reasonable. We're not going to vote on that or find consensus necessarily. It's opinion. It's perfectly rational to do so. So if you wish to comment, go ahead.
Sure. No, I was asking more like, you know, is this the moment that we need to kind of, because this is the moment where the public is giving their input. And I was curious if it was where we needed to kind of give that input. I don't have as far as my opinion on it, I could see benefits going either way. So I look forward to discussing it in more detail at a future board meeting.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. Ms. Dawson.
Yeah, I was just going to say that right now it's so theoretical. And I was just curious, as time goes on and we actually see a map, isn't there more participation from the community once they can start to visualize exactly what you're talking about?
Yeah, so once a map is published, and usually traditionally about 3 maps get published. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but usually it's around 3, so people have variations to comment on. That will then kick into, if you look at that time frame, you have to have at least 2 public hearings after the maps are out. So you put out those first initial maps, and that's at least 7 days before the public hearing. You have a public hearing. Then the demographer can take all the feedback direction from the board, go back, tweak the maps, sometimes create whole new maps. And when I say whole new maps, the demographer that you're using told me the story once that they, after having public input and hearing from a city council, they ended up with like 40 something maps. I don't recommend that, but they do listen and take into account. They then come back, publish those new maps 7 days before a second public hearing. And that's an opportunity for public input again. And you're absolutely right. It becomes less hypothetical and people actually see, and the maps sort of take hold. One of the things that's nice about Pacific Grove is you're not a sprawling community. So there's only so many ways that you can slice this particular pie. So the maps are probably not going to be radically different from each other, no matter how you approach it, but there will be some interesting pieces. I was discussing with the board president beforehand. In my home school district, when they originally went to by trustee area elections, there was one neighborhood that just didn't fit in the anywhere. It just had to be put somewhere. So for population balancing, it got put in an area that really geographically, demographically, and just from living there, it didn't fit there, but it had to be done to be compact to be able to have it all make sense. And then now what's happened is with redistricting, it turns out that they do have to rebalance, and it's going to get, that same area is going to get picked up and moved into a more logical area. So those things, once you have the visuals on it, are so much easier. And just as tonight is not a required public hearing, this was an additional moment of public input. The board at any point along the way can decide, you know, we want to hear more. 2 public hearings once we get the maps are not enough. We want to hear a third one that will fit in between a special meeting. So there'll be plenty of opportunity for that.
Thank you.
Anything, Fernando?
Yes, thank you. At the September presentation, we were offered districtr.org, but Pacific Grove wasn't up and ready yet. Do you know if it's up and ready to play with for our community members?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I don't believe so. And part of this, again, when the census data came out, the demographers, the first thing they had to do is for cities and counties that are going through redistricting, they have to finish their work by the end of the calendar year. So they went first in line, which is why all of your hearings and map creation are happening in January, February, you know, once we're into the new year. But as soon as we get information that it's up and running, and we will continue to ask about that, we will let Ralph know and make sure that you're all informed.
Thank you. And then also the map that was shown in September did not have Pebble Beach on it at all. And then I know that Pebble Beach is split. I don't know where.
Bird Rock.
Bird Rock, yeah, okay. It would just
Actually, it's Bird Rock on one side. It might be. It's Bird Rock and I don't know where the other border is because there has to be a eastward border. We'd have to look.
Yep.
Bird Rock's the southernmost.
Did the other board members feel that it would be nice for the community to see the entire district that we serve as far as kids, like including Pacific Grove?
Yeah.
There, I believe there's a map actually on the
Oh.
webpage. But,
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
So is there anything we can do to get District R up and running a little bit faster? I have one open hand, by the way, board. I'd like to go ahead and go back to Elliot if that's okay with you guys. So,
Yes.
Harold, is there anything we can do to push on the demographer in District R?
We will let the demographer know that you are very interested in getting it running. That's about the best we can do. Again, it's a little crazy right now for them, but we'll keep pushing it.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hazen.
Sorry, just another really quick one. Is it possible for some of the initial maps to have where the current trustees are for those, so that way we could take that into account if we want to in the public? Not necessarily exact addresses, because I probably don't want that to be public, but at least general areas.
Or do you have any objection to being posted on the map? I think that's the first question. If you do, please speak up. How's that?
How posted are we talking?
Oh, star in the general area. How's that?
A big star.
Covers 7 or 8 homes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd be, not to take the floor, but I'd be comfortable with the general area. I'd be comfortable with the general area just so folks can kind of get an idea.
Talk about where I live all the time. It's
Frank or Christy, no concerns.
General area is great.
So the next half of that question is, can it be done? We've agreed that nobody minds if it is done. So it can be done. Jonathan is shaking his head yes.
Yeah, it can be done.
Okay, very good. So we will take that as an item to include on any maps as they get posted initially. Also knowing that ultimately, really, we're going to elect 3 trustees to 4-year terms in 2022. So wherever they come from, they come from. That's it. Oh, yes, come on up, by all means.
If I may.
Yes.
Dr. Rivera, if you go on the webpage on home to parents to residency and scroll down, there's not a beautiful map, but there's a color map there. There you go. That's it. You found it.
Go ahead. Elliot, you still have your hand up. I'm assuming that is residual at this point. Is that correct? Oh, it's down now? Okay, go ahead, Beth.
My question is, once the demographer is finished, the final product, then who signs off on that? How does that get officially stamped?
So at that, I believe it's scheduled for February 17th. There's a final hearing at the district that the district will have, and they will decide, the district board will decide the map that they want to propose to the county committee on school district organization, which is not the district board. And that county committee is the one that has the final say as whether or not that map that the district board chose will be approved or denied.
Elliot, one last question. You lowered your hand. Again, this meeting is to provide input. We've had as high as 22 people, including 3 to 4 members of City Council. Thank you all for being here. Unless somebody speaks up very quickly, we are concluded. Hearing none, thank you all very much. I'd really like to thank the staff who was here tonight and Mr. Freeman and Mr. Barry Smith. Thank you very, very much. Good night.
Very informative.